Welcome back. I hope everything went smoothly with loading your molecule into Blender, and as promised, now we are going to take care of the looks of our molecule. First, before we play a bit with the materials that we are going to assign to our molecule, I would like to show you some tiny tips or tiny tricks on how to modify the shape of the atoms. This is probably something that you don't want to do quite often, but I still would like you to know how to do that, so in case you need it, then you find an easy and quick solution for that. So for example, let's say we would like to change the shape of our carbon molecules, switching them up from, for example, like the ball shape, which is shown here, to something like a cube. This can be easily done in the same menu where we modified the size. So if you open the Create tab again and go to the Atomic Blender utilities, at the lower half there is something that defines the shape of your atom, and by default it's set to sphere. And there you see a quite long list of different shapes. Some of them make more sense than others do. For example, I don't know if a plane, for example, is the object you are looking for, but especially the icospheres that you see here are sometimes quite nice to use. I'm going to change my carbon atoms now into icospheres just to show you how that basically works. You just need to select a new shape. First, of course, select the atom type that you would like to change, then select the shape, and then just click on Replace, and you see now the shape of the atoms has changed. You can do that as often as you like. If you would like to go to a lower resolution version of an icosphere, you can use the 1 version, for example. Then it looks like more of a diamond shape rather than the ball shape. I'm going to go probably for number 2. Oops, I forgot to select. Replace. I'm going to keep it like this, just not only to show you how to change the shape, but also how the shape affects the materials that we are later on going to apply. Good. Of course, you can do that with all the other atoms as well. I'm going to keep it just for the carbon atoms now, but feel free just to play around with the different shapes that you find here. We are going to come back to that menu later again, but for now I'm going to close it just to have it out of the way. Good. Before we start with changing the color and also the material of the atoms, there is one tiny step that I would like to add first, and this is to add a plane where the molecule basically sits on, and the second thing is also to add a backdrop basically. To do that, that's very simple. So you just need to add a plane as a new object, so you can go to Add, Mesh, Plane, or you can do the short command, which is Shift A, and the same menu basically pops up. So we are going to select plane, and now of course that plane is way too small, so we would like to scale it up, and we are also going to do that quickly with a short command. So the plane is still selected, you just hit S for scale again, and then 5 for the size. And then you see your plane gets 5 times the initial size, and then you can hit enter, and the plane keeps the size that you defined. What I would like to have now is also some sort of backdrop, and I would like to have my molecule positioned as it would sit in a corner. That means we need 2 additional planes that make up the wall. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the same size of that, or the same plane and the same size as well. I'm just going to hit Shift D, which is duplicating the plane, hit enter again. Then I'm going to left click on one of the axes. In this case, I'm going to use the red one over there. Hit rotation, type 90 degrees. And then I'm going to move it to the edge of the first plane. And I'm going to do that the same command again. So I'm going to select the first one, hit Shift D, enter. Rotation, in this case, I'm going to use the y-axis. So select the y-axis, hit R for rotation, 90 again, and then I'm just going to move it again to the back. Make sure that the planes overlap so that there is no gap between the planes to ensure that there is really a nice sharp corner that you get. The problem now is, of course, as you see, that the molecule sits in the middle of our plane. This is not something we would like to have, but that's something we can easily solve by just selecting all of our planes, and we are moving them down. I'm going to position it right at the point where that hydrogen atom here basically touches the floor. So you see that that's a bit tricky to do, but that's also some fine modification that we can take care of later on. Perfect. So this is basically my setup now. The planes not only serve as like decoration or something, they also have a very important part to play when it comes to catching the shadow, because we are going to later on set on the light of the scene, and then the planes are going to be responsible to show the shadow, of course, from the molecule. Perfect. So this is what we are working with now. I'm going to go back to camera view, and now for the first time we are going to see what the default settings would look like basically. So make sure that you change your render engine from EV to cycles. You can of course stay in EV, but the shading and all the material that we are going to do is designed for cycles now, and your outcome might look totally different if you stay in EV. So cycles is the rendering engine that you would like to go for. Then, to see what your current image looks like, there is also a short key to do that. You just hit Z, and then you get 4 options on how the shading basically should be shown. And rendered is basically the preview version. So this is what our scene looks like. We have a default lamp that is there, and the molecule basically sits in the middle, and the lamp, of course, is responsible also for the shadow that is casted. Good. Before we are going to use different materials now, I'm going to go back into solid mode. So just hit Z again, select solid. And there is something that is, at least to me, something I don't like about the way the bonds are colored. So you see that mostly half of the bond basically is the color of the oxygen. In this case, half of the bond is the color of the carbon in that case. The same is true for nitrogen. What I would like to have is that every bond has basically the same color, and in my case I'm going to give it a white or neutral color. This can be done also quite easily. You just need to make sure that you select the right option. Here you see is the very long list of all the parts that come with our histidine, with our molecule. I'm just going to close the upper section because we don't need it and it saves a bit of space. Every atom that you see here basically, so it's the carbon, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, the oxygen, has a subsection. The carbon atom has a subsection of the atom itself and the carbon sticks. So that means that section basically defines, or that part of the carbon atom defines what color the bonds have. It's called sticks in this case, but they mean bond basically by it. So that's the default name. So this is where we need to do the modifications. To show that quickly, I'm going to start with the modification of the oxygen bonds. We are going to click on the subsection of the oxygen bonds, and then I'm going to bring up the material menu. The material menu is at the very bottom of the list here. And if you click on material, you see there is nothing selected, which is not the truth. So the bonds already have a color. You just need to click on that menu to open it, and then click on the first option, which says Oxygen Sticks Cup. And this one, and now you see it's basically red. I'm going to show you more materials later on, but for now, one very important thing you need to know is that if different parts of your structure have the same material and you change that material, it's going to change for all of the structures. This is indicated by the number which is next to the name of the material. So the name of everything that correlates with oxygen is basically oxygen, and it's used 3 times, which makes sense. There are 2 atoms and the bonds. To show you how that basically affects your molecule, I'm going to pop into the rendered view again. And now, if I change the color to something completely different, you see that everything that is connected to oxygen basically changes to the new color. Not only the balls, but also the bond. Of course, I'm going to go back to red because this is where I would like to stay. So what we are going to do now is, since all the bonds should have the same material, we are going to make a new material which is not linked to any type of atom, and then we are going to assign that material to all the bonds. So whenever we would like to change the color of the bonds, all the bonds are affected, and not only the bonds that belong to oxygen or belong to nitrogen and so on and so forth. To do that, we just need to unlink basically the material from the oxygen term. That's very easy to do. Just click on the number over there, and then it's basically unlinked. I'm just going to switch back to solid mode because then you might hear it in the background. My fans are acting up a bit, and so it might be a bit quieter. And I'm going to change the name of that material now to bonds, so that we can easily identify it. And I would like to have a plain white material. So I'm just clicking into the color tab, put all the colors of the RGB scale to 1, which is just plain white. Good. Now in the solid mode, nothing changed. And also if we switch to the rendered mode now, we see that nothing changed in the rendered mode as well. But this is because there is a second part of the bonds, which is called oxygen sticks cylinder in that case. And we did not change the color of the cylinders now. The cup is something that we don't see, which is on the inside of the atom in that case. The cylinder is the thing that's on the outside, that's visible. And you see, also here, this is still linked to oxygen, and we are going to link it now to the color we defined for the bonds. So we don't have to change the color here again, but we just pop open our menu, select bonds, and now we see that actually the color changed, the red is gone, and the white appears. There is still the gray from the carbon, but this is something that we are going to change now as well. So I'm going to go back to solid mode again. So we are basically done with the sticks of the oxygen now, so I can collapse that again. We need to do the same for the sticks of the nitrogen and for the carbon as well, and I'm also going to do the same for the hydrogen, even though I wouldn't have to because they are white already. But just to make sure that everything is affected by the color change, I'm also going to do it for the hydrogen. Open the menu now for the nitrogen, select the cup section, go into the tab, select bonds, go to nitrogen, do the same here, bonds. And now you see already, also in the preview it changed. I'm going to do the same for hydrogen. There should be no change because it's the same color. And I'm going to do the same for carbon. Great. And if I switch back into the rendered mode now, I see that all my bonds are white, and that's exactly how I would like to have it. If I change my mind afterwards, and if I would like to give it a different color, then all the bonds are affected, which is quite convenient to have. But for now, I'm going to stay with white. Changing the color now of all the other bonds is something that is very similar to the process that I showed you now. Also, in that case, if you would like to change the color specifically to the atom, make sure to open up the menu and select lowest level of the menu basically. Here we see the default color of the carbon, and that's like a grayish tone. And you see if I can make it a bit darker now, go back down all the way down to black nearly, and make it lighter, apply every other color that I would like to. Until now, we just changed the color and we did not basically change the material. And this is something we are going to do now. And we are going to use the carbon atoms for that. What I would like to achieve in that case, I would like to have a glossy look to the carbon atoms that that looks a bit like glass or like milky glass or something like this. And that can be achieved actually quite easily. To do that, we're just going to hit use nodes, and the default shading, if you hit the use nodes command, is principled BSDF. And this is already something that is very powerful to use, because there are a lot of different settings that you can choose from. I'm going to go back to that shader later on, because this is not the one that we are going to use to achieve the glassy look. To get that, you can just hit on that section over there where surface is indicated, and I would like to go for glass. So you see there are a lot of predefined shaders. I'm going to go through some of them, but in that case, to be honest, it's a good idea just to play with all of them a bit, because you might get an idea what they do if I explain it to you, but it's way better for you to discover them on your own. So we are going to go through some of them just to get you started, but afterwards feel free to play with all of those shaders. Good. So if I hit glass, we immediately see that something changed. There is also a tab which is called preview, which is quite convenient because it gives you a preview of your material. This is especially helpful if you have a not so strongly powered machine, because you see that staying in the rendered preview of your scene, it might get quite difficult for the computer to keep up, basically. So you see that the computer tries to make a fine rendering of that image, but as I said before, if your computer is not highly powered, you might have problems, for example, moving in your menu, and you might get some lags. So it's a good idea actually to define what your material should look like in the preview section, and then later on just go to the rendered section. And that's what I'm going to do now. Good. I'm just going to bring it up a bit. So you see what you can do here now is, of course, you can change the color. I'm going to actually give it a bit of a yellow tone to it, and I'm going to make it a bit darker. And then there is something which is called roughness. Roughness is just the value that defines how glossy your material should be. And as I said, I would like to go for something like a milky glass look. I'm going to keep that value actually at 0.5 as it was before. The IOR is the refraction index. It is normally set by default to 1.45, and you see if I go down to 1, it would be something like air. If I go up to 1.2, for example, it goes closer to something like water, and I think the 1.45, if I'm not mistaken, should be something like water, glass type of refraction index. Also, in that case, you can play a bit with that. If you go to values that are higher, you see that at a certain point it actually gets very tense and there is no refraction happening anymore, and it looks more like a metal shader basically. But I'm going to stay with the 1.45. If I go in the render mode again, now you see that all of the carbon atoms are affected by that. What happens now is that the bonds, of course, do not end at the surface of the carbon atom, so you will basically see them shining through. And this is something we are going to keep because it nicely represents what that kind of shader, what the glass shader basically does. So it's transparent to a certain degree, and this is an effect that is something that you probably would like to have. We are going to also change now the way the nitrogen and the oxygen atoms look. And also for the hydrogen, actually. Let's do the hydrogen first. For that, we are going to select the hydrogen ball. We are going to use nodes again. And I'm going to make, again, I'm going to select the glass shader again. But this time, I'm going to give it a bit of a twist. So you see there is the surface menu and there is the volume menu. And we did not change anything about the volume when we modified the carbon atoms, but we are going to do that now. So you can apply a shader to the volume as well. So there are a couple of shaders that make sense. but most of them actually don't. So one shader that definitely makes sense in the combination of glass is emission. That means you have light being emitted from the volume of your object. And if you click on that, you see that actually now your atoms over there look like a milky light bulb. You can also change the color of the light that is emitted, and you can change the strength. I'm going to go up to 2 so that they are a bit lighter. Good. Then I'm going to apply a different shader to the nitrogen atom. And here I'm going to play with the principled a bit. The principled shader is actually a very powerful and very nice shader, as I mentioned before. As I also said, play with the values to learn what it basically does. I'm going to play with one value now, which is the roughness. What the principled shader basically looks like, it looks like a glossy part of China, basically. So it looks like there is reflection on the surface, which looks very glossy and very shiny, and I actually liked it a lot. So if you turn down the roughness, you see that you go from a rather dull looking surface to something very glossy and very shiny. I'm not really happy with the blue that is chosen by default. I'm going to go for something stronger, a bit like that. And is there something else I would like to? I'm going to keep it like this for now. Then I'm going to also change the same for the oxygen. Here I'm going to do the same modifications as I did for the nitrogen. I'm going to make the shader look glossy, and I'm also going to go for a bit of a different red. So that's pink. Let's go into that direction. Not that bright. Something like this. I am now having second thoughts about the yellowish tone of my carbon. I'm going to change that, actually. I'm going to keep it white because I think it would be way too many colors. Good. Then I would say now is a perfect time to do our first test rendering to see actually how those materials look like in a smoothly rendered scene. We did not talk about setting the or setting the values for the final render yet, but this is something that we are going to do now. That's the perfect time actually to do that. There are two things that are very important when it comes to setting the values for your final render. The first thing is the number of samples that are going to be used. There is unfortunately no clear number or no number that fits every scene. It highly depends on your scene, how many samples you should use. The higher the number of samples is, the nicer your scene is going to look like. So what you see here is that's the number that's used for your final render, and this is the number of samples used for the viewport. So this is basically what you see now. That's 32 samples, and you see our final render goes up to 128. We are going to keep that number because it should be sufficient for that scene. I'm going to show you some extra tricks where you can keep the number of samples low and still get a decent image. The problem is that the higher the number that is for rendering, the longer your rendering is going to take. So keep that in mind. Especially for just test renderings, it's totally fine to keep a lower number of samples, so don't worry about that. Good, then the second obvious question is, how large is our image going to be in the final rendering? That can be set in the output properties section. So you see there is a X and a Y resolution, which is given in pixels, and there is something that can define 100% of the given resolution. You can, for a test rendering, for example, you can go lower. For your final renderings, you can go higher. If you, for example, render for a cover image for a journal, make sure that you set the resolution already to the resolution the journal would like to have. So just check their recommendations and then set the value here, and your final rendering is going to be perfect for their journal cover. Also, I'm going to keep that one as it is. And I would say let's try how our first rendering looks like. Oh yeah, before we do that, I promised to show you a trick on how to get a decent rendering with a lower number of samples. There is a quite nice feature in Blender which is called denoising. And the settings for that can be found in the View Layer Properties window. There are a couple of things that we don't need. I'm going to close all of those things. In the lower section, there is something which is called denoising, and I'm going to tick that. Just keep the values as they are. Most of the time, the default values are perfect for everything, so just leave them as they are. And just tick denoise, and then I would say let's see how our final render basically looks like. For that, you just go to render and then go to render image or hit F12, and let's see what happens now. So what should happen now is that there should be a new window popping up and tiny tiles should form. Those tiles basically are now showing the calculated image, and I'm going to zoom in, and you see that with the number of renderings that we chose, we see a quite grainy image, so it's not really smooth. But suddenly there are smooth tiles appearing, and this is the denoising function. So you see on top of here that 4 tiles are already denoised, and this is what the denoising function basically does. So it takes the grainy looking image, processes it a bit further, and then you get the smooth looking image. So I'm going to leave that up now until it's finished, and then I'm going to come back to you. And now we are back with our rendering. So what you see now is that actually our milky glass object is really milky, which is, I guess, something that's good. And the glossy atoms over there have a nice reflection of parts of our molecule, and also a bit of the light source, basically, that's here. We are going to play with how the molecule looks a bit later on, but what I would like to do now is I would like to play a bit with how the lighting is basically done, because this is something that's very important also for the overall look of the scene and also for the molecule. What you see now is that we just have one light source that casts a quite nice shadow, and there is nothing more, so it's just a plain background. Let's have a look how that light source is basically positioned and what it represents. To see that, because I'm not going to do the modifications on the molecule now, I'm just going to collapse that tab and go to that one over there. So let's look where the light source basically is. The light source is that tiny dot over there. You can select it by clicking on it or also select it in the menu. The default light source is a lamp. Something that is a bit easier to deal with because it gives a more global lighting is a sun instead of a lamp. You can change whatever light source you have into a different light source and go back and forth. To do that, you just select your light source, and if you do so, there is an additional menu popping up here, which is Object Data Properties, and that changes depending on the object that you select. So it's a dynamic menu basically. And you see that here we have a point light, and I'm going to transform that into a sun by just clicking on sun. Something that happens now, if I go into the rendered mode, is that your image looks way overexposed now. So what you need to remember is that the settings for a sun are not necessarily the perfect settings for a point lamp, for example. So now we have a sun with the strength of 1000. The decent normal settings are basically for a sun are somewhere around 1, 2. So if I turn that down, you see it already looks way better. What you also see that now we have a bit of more shading going on or shadow going on where our planes basically meet, so the corner that is formed. What I would like to have now is I would like to have a shadow that is more like more directly going to the floor rather than just tilted to the side. And this is something we can control with the position of our sun as well. For that, I'm going to go into a different view. You can change between different views. So if you hit 7 on your num keyboard, then you're going to go into top view. If you're working on a machine that does not have a section for the numbers, there is also a chance for you to use the numbers that are normally on your key, like the ones above your letters. So if you go to Edit Preferences, I'm going to enlarge that window a bit. And then if we go into the input section, there is something which is called Emulate Numpad. And if you tick that one, you can either use the numbers from your numpad, or you can use the numbers that are above your keyboard. So both of those things should work fine now. And now what we see is that this is the position of the lamp. And if I go to another predefined view, which is the one view, so we get a side view which is aligned on the y-axis, we see that this is basically the angle of the sun, and that's something we can change. So what I would like to have now is that that beam, basically the orange light that you see here is basically the direction of the beam, goes down a bit steeper. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. It should go down a bit steeper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a rotation on the y-axis. And so that you see it nicely, I'm going to use the menu over there by just clicking and moving my mouse. You see that there is a rotation on the y-axis. Sometimes you see there are predefined values there already. Sometimes it's a good idea actually to set all the values to 0. So that would be a sun that would have approximately the same properties, and it would be around noon. So if I go to the camera view again, you see that actually the light goes down directly through the z-axis in that case. That's a bit much, a bit too straight for me. So I'm going to do a bit of rotation on the y-axis and go back into the camera view. And you also see now our walls basically have different shades. So this one is a bit darker, that's a bit lighter, and also the floor is a bit lighter. And the shadow is also nicely visible. You can also define how your shadows should look like. That can be done with the angle command over here. That means if you, for example, decrease the angle to something like 1, your shadow gets very sharp. So it would be like the sun would be around noon again, very defined, very sharp shadows. If you increase that, I'm going to go for something like 20, the shadows are very soft and very fuzzy basically. This is again totally something that's up to you, what kind of style you would like. I'm going to go for something like 5, something in between. Good. Normally the sunlight is, or the sun lamp basically is the one that's the easiest to handle, because all your objects in one scene are going to be lit equally. You probably noticed that we already incorporated something that I'm going to also incorporate in the overall lighting later on, and that's something like objects that emit light. And we did that for our hydrogen atoms, for example. So what if you would like to have a scene now that's rather dark and only the hydrogen atoms emitting light and basically lighting the scene with those parts? So that's something we can try right away, because it's quite easy to do. Do not delete your lamp, because you might want to use it later on. There is something very simple. You can just hide it from the view by clicking on the eye icon over there, and you can hide it from rendering by clicking on the camera icon over there as well. And now you see basically most of the light is gone. The background lighting is just a very dark gray. So there is normally always a lighting coming from the background, and we could set that actually to 0. If you go to the world properties, this is the color of your background. As I said, it's normally dark gray, and you can change that. You can go up and you can go down, so then it's basically black. I'm not going to set it to completely black, but rather a really dark gray. And if I zoom in now, you see that the hydrogens are probably, or the emission from the hydrogen is not enough now to light the complete scene. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have them emit more light. So I'm opening up that menu again, go to hydrogen and go to where I can change the material. And you see we set it to 2. You could go up to 10, for example. It seems like not a lot of things changed, but it takes a couple of seconds to calculate basically the light. Another option in that case, and I think that would be a better option, rather than having the the hydrogens emit light, we could have our bonds emit light, because then all the atoms would be connected and indirectly lit by the bonds. And this is something I'm going to try now. So I'm going to switch the material of our hydrogens to the principled BSD, as we had before, and also I'm going to make it glossy. So now our scene is super dark, as you see, but it is actually quite handy that we gave all the bonds the same material, because now if I just select one of those objects, and I'm going to change it to glass, and then I'm going to change the emission to the volume to emission. Now we see that all the bonds emit light. They don't do it very strongly, so I think we can go up to 3 in that case. Now, of course, it looks quite funny because our carbon atoms are transparent, so they are basically lit from the inside, which is something that looks actually quite weird, to be honest. But this is an example on how you could use objects to emit light. So you don't necessarily need to have a sun. You could also use objects as light sources. Sometimes it makes quite a lot of sense to not use the objects that are in your main focus, in that case in our molecule, but rather have something on the outside to emit light, to light the scene. I'm going to show you an example on what I mean by that. And for that, I'm going to change our scene back to be a scene with light, and I'm also going to remove all emission from any object. So I'm going to remove the emission from the bonds, and I'm going to give them also the white shader that we normally have. So what you could do now is, I'm going to go back to the solid view. I would like to have light objects that are basically reflected in the glossy objects of our atoms that we have. So we decided to go for a glossy shader for oxygen and for nitrogen. And I'm also going to change the carbon to that one later on. And I would like to have something that is reflected in the surface of those atoms, to see to have something like you would have the reflection of a window, for example. And this is something that you can do super easily. For that, we are going to make a new plane again, similar to the one that we had at the beginning. So it's basically just plane. I'm going to move it a bit on the outside. I'm going to go for in the top view to make it easier for me to arrange those things. So I'm going to do something like a window now, which has basically 4 light areas. So I'm going to duplicate that plane again, move it a bit to the left, to the right, and basically do the same with those 2 planes as well. Perfect. So the only thing I have to do now is I need to make those planes emit light, which is super easy to do. So we go to the shading menu again, click on new, and we saw that there is actually a shader called emission, and that's exactly the one that we would like to have. And if I go into the rendered mode, you see that basically that plane emits light now. I'm going to make it a bit stronger. I'm going to go up to 5 probably. But of course, all my other planes should emit the same light. So I'm going to call that material emission. And I'm going to assign it to those 4 planes as well, to make sure that if I change the emission shader again, that it's the same for all the planes. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just move it up and position it somewhere above our object. And now let's see what's happening. So if I go back into the camera view again, and I go back to the rendered view, what you see now is that suddenly, and for that I think I have to zoom in, suddenly we see the reflection of that object in the glossy surface of our molecule, which is actually super cool, because now it looks like there would be a window somewhere close to our molecule that is reflected in the molecule surface, basically. That's a bit tiny, but that can be solved easily by just scaling our planes. That might be a little bit large now, but let's give it a try. Of course, what happens now is if you scale up the plane, it gives lighting to the complete scene as well. And in that case, that happened now. So you see that everything is super light now. Of course, then you need to turn down the emission value. Instead of having 5, I think 2 should be enough now. You could go even lower, basically. Probably also 1 would be enough. There is a second thing that basically happens now is you see there is a shadow appearing on your plane, because of course the planes themselves cast a shadow because they are on top of your objects. That's something that can be also solved quite easily. So if you would just, so the planes basically should just be an object that emits light but does not cast any shadows. And this can be done super easily as well. So I'm going to go into the rendered mode again so that you immediately see how things change. So you can just select one of your planes and then go into the object properties. And there is a tab which is called visibility. And there you can just deselect the shadow. So now you have an object that emits light but does not cast a shadow. And you just do that for all of those objects. And if we hit the camera view again, now you see that only the sun basically casts, or only your molecule casts the shadow from the light that comes from the sun and not from the planes. What I'm going to do now, as I said before, I'm going to change now the shader of the carbon atoms as well. Do not glass, but I also would like to have something glossy where you see the nice reflection. So there is another shader which is called Glassy that actually looks like metal basically, and there is the roughness area that you can also, or the roughness value that you can change. So I would like to have something like that looks like brushed metal, which is would be the glossy shader. Another shader that looks even more like brushed metal would be that one, because you have like a focal point where you really have like where the roughness basically is centered. And I'm probably going to use that one. Let's go to 0.5, keep it like that. Good. I'm going to render that scene again by just hitting render image, and I'm going to see you again when that image is rendered. Good, see you in a couple of minutes. And this is what the final rendering looks like. So you see we have a nice reflection in our atoms from the object that emit light. So whenever there is something glossy, you're going to see the surrounding basically as a reflection in that object. You even see like tiny elements of the molecule itself reflect in the same, in parts of the molecule. Good. So that would be a very basic and simple styling concerning light and materials for your scene now. So I'm going to leave you again with that information. So go ahead, play with all the materials that you can find in Blender, play with the shapes. Go ahead, be brave, and also play with the lighting of your overall world. And I'm going to see you in the next tutorial, where we are going to turn that molecule in something rather cute. That's a bit of a more playful tutorial. We are going to create a fluffy molecule out of that one. So we are going to select one type of atom. In that case, it's going to be the carbon atom again, and we are going to make it fluffy. So if you would like to join that funny tutorial again, keep watching and join me for the next one. And of course, before I leave, I should also tell you how to save your final render. This is super easy to do. If your rendering is finished, you can just click on Image, then say Save As, locate the place where you would like to save it, define what kind of image type it should be, and then hit Save, and this is basically it. Good, so see you later.